You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network. This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. This week we're joined by Tina Rosan, Associate Professor at Temple University, and Stephen Wheeler, Professor at UC Davis, to talk about their new book, Reimagining Sustainable Cities, Strategies for Designing Greener, Healthier, More Equitable Communities. Stay with us. Today's podcast is brought to you by our super generous, amazing Patreon supporters. It's 2022, and we're celebrating 8 years of the Talking Headways podcast. So to join this merry band of infrastructure nerds and zoning wizards, go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. $10 a month will still get you a bus-only scarf. I promise I'm still working on new designs and formats. $2 a month will get you stickers and a handwritten note, but any support is welcome and much appreciated. That's patreon.com/theoverheadwire. Today's podcast is also brought to you by the projects of The Overhead Wire. Whether it's our daily newsletter first established in 2006 or our audiobook version of Raymond Unwin's 1909 classic Town Planning and Practice, find out more today at theoverheadwire.com. Well, Steve Wheeler and Tina Rosan, welcome to the Talking Headways podcast.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thanks.
Well, thanks for being here. Before we get started, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? We'll start with Tina and then we'll go Steve next.
Sure. So I am an associate professor in geography and urban studies at Temple University. I have a master's and a PhD in urban planning, and I have done a lot of research on urban sustainability and climate and governance issues.
And I try to be an activist academic. That is, I was an activist for many years before I went back to grad school. I worked in DC with the organization Friends of the Earth, and then I worked in the Bay Area with a group called Urban Ecology, which took a very holistic approach to sustainable cities. And finally, I decided grad school was worthwhile and wound up teaching at UC Davis, where I am a professor, actually in the landscape architecture program, although I am not a landscape architect, but I teach urban design and sustainable development.
We might have been in the same building for a certain amount of time in downtown Oakland. When I was at Reconnecting America, we were at the old historic Central building. Is that where you had your office?
It was like 14th and Broadway. I can't remember the name of the building, but
yeah. I think we were in the same building. That's funny.
Yeah.
Crossing paths many years later. How did you all get into cities? Like, what was the thing that kind of sparked your interest? Was it something that happened when you were younger, or did it kind of develop over time? What was the impetus for interest?
Well, I grew up in Brooklyn, so I sort of feel like I'm like the Sesame Street generation. So my parents were both urban planners, and my dad's an architect. And I always loved being from New York, and I guess I never really understood places that were not urban because I had spent so much time in cities. And then when I went to college, I ended up going to college in the middle of nowhere. And I think for me, that really cemented my interest in cities. So I've sort of never left. So I'm in Philly now. And I think there's so much possibility in the city, and it's such an exciting place. And I've always been a real optimist about that this is our future.
And I grew up in suburban Massachusetts, and I saw this tidal wave of suburbia just taking over the entire eastern half of Massachusetts, it seemed. And it wasn't just subdivisions. There was a lot of what we would now call rural sprawl, houses sort of tucked here and there, but taking away any sort of wild quality. And socially, I saw a whole lot of very lonely people and very disconnected people and very dysfunctional families, mine own, of course, being included. But it just was clear that this wave of suburbanization was not working for a lot of people. Then later, I was working in DC on the nuclear arms race, and I decided eventually that I wanted to spend my life doing something positive rather than trying to stop bad things from happening. So, having sustainable and livable cities and equitable cities seems like a positive vision for the future. So that attracted me.
Well, that dovetails into the book. Reimagining Sustainable Cities, Strategies for Designing Greener, Healthier, More Equitable Communities. How did you all get together to start working on this? You're on different coasts. That's always interesting to me to hear how people, get the idea for a book and then kind of come together to put something onto paper.
Steve and I were on a lot of panels together at the ACSP, which is the Association of Collegiate Schools of Planning conference. And I think both of us were frustrated that the framing of sustainability wasn't broad enough and people weren't asking like tough enough questions. So initially we actually titled the book Asking Radical Questions About Sustainability. But, as the term radical became radicalized, we weren't radical enough, or we were too radical. So we just thought, we're going to write this book that is about kind of that you could use in your classes, in your sustainable cities classes, that would answer a lot of the questions, and that it wouldn't be just wholly depressing, which is like a lot of the books. And it would sort of kind of frame it in a broad term.
And our original idea was to write the most non-academic book possible and to have it be fun and, upbeat and very accessible and lots of images and stuff like that. And of course, being academics, the footnotes sort of crept back in a little bit, but we did try to minimize them and make it, a reasonably uplifting and very accessible read, giving people ideas about ways that things could be different, and speaking in particular to younger people, because we have to think, what's the end of the century going to be like? What's the next century going to be like? How can we get excited about the future in contrast to all the gloom and doom that's out there?
Well, that was something interesting that I noticed as well, is that you all mentioned that you wanted it to be used in classes, but I think it could be used for city councils and for other folks who are interested in learning what the possibilities are of different strategies, different ideas. There's so much in here. I mean, most of the time when I'm putting together questions for a book, there's, one thread of a topic that goes through the whole book, and it's a specific topic and it's very close. But there's so many topics. Actually, I had a hard time kind of organizing my thoughts because there's so many topics. And I think that that's actually good from the standpoint of it shares so much information about so many different things. And it's not just kind of pigeonholed in one section. Did you actually kind of put that thought into the book when you're writing it? I mean, thinking about, just like you already mentioned that you kind of did, but I want to kind of understand more about how putting so much into the book kind of opens people's minds.
Well, in cities and towns, everything fits together. And we also take a theoretical approach known as social ecology, which likewise argues that many different dimensions of our world fit together and that we have to be aware of those interactions in order to really get things done and develop better paths for the future. So we tried to get enough detail on every one to be interesting to a whole range of readers. And we tried to point out the ways that things do fit together. It's not easy. And the problem with some of the more right-wing visions out there is that they are much simpler and more linear. And it's more challenging to get our heads around the interconnections of current systems. But that's really what's kind of needed in the long run.
I would say we definitely had hoped that the book would not just be used in classes. If you think about the book, like Steve and I both teach sustainable cities classes. So we had a bunch of questions that people are kind of always asking us, like, how do we get to carbon neutrality? So sort of trying to work through that. But I think what you see in the book, and this is really from Steve a lot, is the kind of vast knowledge of just like a whole bunch of stuff going on in the world and trying to figure out how to put that all in one place. Because that's what I had felt when I teach sustainable cities is, it'll be a YouTube video here and I know a little case study here, but it's like just all this little tiny bits of knowledge. So how do we like craft it into one place? So my sense of the book is like, we sort of want you to get excited about it and then do your own research afterwards and like keep going on the thinking. But it's really the beginning of sort of a cataloging of like, there is a lot of really cool stuff happening that is pushing against these norms. And like, this is just like the beginning of a way of thinking about that. So that, I think the book, it wants people who are practical to read it and to add their voices to it and to say, oh, well, yeah, we tried that here. And we want to know more about that. So I think that that's what is actually fun about the book, is that it's sort of just the beginning of like a slightly more positive conversation that's really filled with a lot of examples that come from many years of studying these issues.
If I can pick up on that a bit further, there are really interesting examples of communities all over the world doing things differently, or that have done things differently. And in the US particularly, we tend to think, oh, we've got the right way of doing things here, but we don't. And we've got to learn from history and from the rest of the world. And that process of being more open and learning, I think, is where the hope in the future lies. The recent book, The Dawn of Everything by David Graeber and his co-author, is a little bit similar. It takes a different view anthropologically of human history, going back, and particularly archaeologically and prehistory, looking at all these interesting experiments that communities did worldwide or societies did, as opposed to the linear Western European civilization as the pinnacle of everything model. So anyway, that's where we were coming from.
Well, you talk in the book about how you feel like we've specialized a little bit too much. And I feel like this actually pushes people in another direction to look more at the larger picture. And I think that's a good thing. It's something that I try to do with my newsletter. I mean, I could focus on transportation only, but we talk about, a number of different strategies and a number of different topics because it's important to kind of go further out from one silo, it feels like.
The field of transportation is a great example of that. In the 20th century, it was kind of taken over by the engineering side of things. And there were standards that were laid down by national associations such as AASHTO, and streets had to be a certain width. And people were locked into a whole bunch of simple goals and ways of designing streets. And then toward the end of the 20th century and now in the 21st, people are realizing, oh, we need a much broader approach. We need to really have designers involved rather in addition to engineers. And we need to have things like complete streets, which account for all the user groups out there. And we need to have things like green streets, which have ecological function. And so there has been a vast broadening out, and some of the old engineering frameworks are now seen as way too constricting.
And Steve, I think that's also true if you think about something like green stormwater infrastructure, right? In the past, you'd have, some engineers who would just figure out how to get you the clean water and build the pipes. And now we're asking people to think about, green stormwater management is related to parks and playgrounds, and it's also connected to gentrification. So we need people who are skilled in the technical, but we also need them to understand the historical and the economic and, the past kind of history that has shaped the urban environment. And because if you just walk in with your engineering solution and you don't understand history, you're not going to get to that equitable place because you don't understand how complex it is. And I think that is the story that we are trying to tell, is that, cities are exciting. They're also super complicated, and they are embedded in a lot of value systems and history and kind of normative ways of thinking. And we actually have to push back on that and imagine something different. And, as an academic, I've had people say to me like, oh, Tina, why are you fighting the refinery? Because we're always going to have a refinery. And I keep asking, well, why? Why is it there? Why do I have to have that refinery in my city? Is there another way? And I think that's what is exciting about like being allowed to ask the questions and to kind of reimagine. It does open the possibilities of a different type of future.
And in the book, you go outside of the typical transportation and land use and technical ideas to move towards the government side, towards thinking about governing systems. I mean, you talk about reform capitalism, social democracy, democratic socialism. Do you think supporters of these types of like systems that you talk about explain them very well? I found that you all explain them very well. I think maybe I understand them better than I did before, and I felt like I somewhat did understand.
Well, that's wonderful. We appreciate hearing that. We are really just beginning those structural change discussions currently in the US and probably in Britain and other places as well. We are hopefully nearing the end of a wave of populism and neoliberal domination, and we need new models. And so those are starting to come on the scene. We had people like Bernie Sanders and so forth, articulating things that none of us thought would ever get said in a mainstream election campaign. But we need much more of it, and we need a whole generation of new leaders. And we need, again, to look to other countries. Like I look to, it's easy to look to Canada in some ways. Well, the provinces in Canada have the ability to look at a metropolitan area and say, this is not working. All these local governments are fighting each other. It's totally fragmented across this whole jurisdictional landscape. We're just going to change things. We're going to reamalgamate. Instead of 49 different local governments, we're going to have 5. And they have the power to do that. The provinces, statutorily have that power. There are pros and cons, of course, to everything. But in the US, we don't rethink yet that way. And so often we are mired in quicksand. All the local governments, in a metro region, just looking out for their own self-interest and undercutting one another.
It feels a lot like the idea of inertia we're stuck with. You use actually in the book a lot BAU, business as usual. I'm wondering also what made you kind of think about comparing the business as usual case and inertia to sustainable practices, because I feel like we're stuck in the 50 states. We're stuck in metropolitan areas that are made up of 250 different municipalities. And structurally, it seems like it's not really working very well, but it's business as usual. So people keep going, and inertia continues to bring us down this road.
I mean, one of the things I would say is that climate change and COVID are disruptors of business as usual. And, we tend to think that there's no other way of doing things, but we can see that, you can have conferences on Zoom and you can do all these things that you didn't think you could do a few years ago, and have conversations that are, completely different ways of thinking. So things can change, but you have to be willing to first admit that the current system is creating all these really negative situations, and climate change is the epitome of the negative situation. We're basically, business as usual is basically going to drown us. And the idea that all these cities are going to be able to sort of use property tax revenues isn't going to work anymore when a lot of their land is going to be underwater. And, so a lot of the things that kind of allow business as usual to just keep going, I don't think are like nature is going to stop that. So it's not going to be just us. It's going to be, we are seeing that business as usual is a disaster. And so we need some other options, and it doesn't mean you have to throw everything out, but it does mean you have to rethink and reimagine and try new things. And that's what you see all around the world. People are trying new things and they're reevaluating, is this really the kind of world we want to live in? Is this what we want to leave for our grandchildren? Am I like, why are all these people depressed? What is wrong with the society? So you really have to admit you have a problem, and then you can move on. But I think that has been accelerated. The problem is coming for us. We're living in it. We can't hide.
I think all of us are submerged within an ocean of details in our everyday lives. And it's very hard to figure out what are the paths to a better future. The right in the US has done a pretty good job of articulating a path forward, a particular scenario, which is neoliberalism, the free, quote unquote, free market economy and individual freedom and concepts like that. The left has not done that good a job of articulating alternatives. And so I think all of us need to start doing that more. And we have tried to do that in this book a bit. There is no one particular path, but there are a number of paths that could work. One of them could be something approaching social democracy. That has examples in Northern Europe and other places. We could go further. We could think about an economy that is not for profit at all, that is based on cooperatives or various sharing models, or a degrowth economy or other things such as that. But spelling these different pathways out, I think, is part of the task of the next decade or so.
In many ways, it's a political book. I'm wondering if you set out to be very political, or if it's just part of the discussion about sustainable cities and the way that we're moving towards them.
You can't take politics out of virtually anything. Politics is woven into our lives. and into our communities and societies. I think feminism realized that back, a couple generations ago. And certainly things like racism are woven in too, and they're political, and social inequality. We try to make links between very nuts and bolts changes. Okay, the width of a street, or, who has access to a public space, or housing, what type of housing programs do we have in a given city or state? Those nuts and bolts things, and, bigger political paradigms or directions. And it's hard to do that, but, we all can practice that.
Yeah, no, I think it's interesting that you think it's political, because I thought we sort of tried not to make it too political. But I mean, I think it has and maybe this is the way the right and the left divide, but there are different views about how we got here and how we get out of it. And I think we see a really strong role for government to help us get out of it. There's not the faith that somehow if we just let the private sector roll, they're going to solve climate change for us. So I think one thing that kind of runs through the book is this idea of sort of caring about, can we build a society and cities that actually, take the time to understand the life conditions of people and the forces that created them, and then think about what are the ways to undo them or rebuild communities. And so you have to be really intentional about that. And maybe that is political, but, I think that that's also kind of what we owe, if as people who are involved in shaping places, we need to get to that level of, like, what are we doing this for? And what do we owe citizens and the people we work for? And what kind of places do we all deserve to live in? Yeah. So maybe that's political. I think of it sort of like more just, the right thing to do, but,
If I can take another crack at that question, we're not political in the sense of being Democrat or Republican or anything like that.
No.
But I think we are political in the sense of trying always to look at where power is in cities and towns and societies, and how could we get power and the various interests that exist behind better solutions and develop solutions that benefit everyone, including the least powerful, in addition to those who do have some power.
And that's something you bring up in the book as well, is equity, intersectionality, thinking about things together that sometimes have been separate. We talked about this earlier about the connection points between all of it. But there's also this like spatial inequality. And I was actually really, drawn into the story about how, Kentucky and the Bay Area really aren't all that different. I'm wondering if you could share a little bit more about kind of those connections that you make between places that seem very different, but are actually very similar in the way that they are inequitable spatially and for people in general.
Yeah, that's a big topic.
It's all big topics.
Worldwide, we have a lot of winner regions and loser regions, or winner communities and loser communities. We have capital that is draining from some places to other places, and talent and resources of many types. And some of those places, let me use the example of Kentucky, where my dad's family is from. It was a fairly self-sufficient farming culture 100 years ago. People grew most of what they needed to eat, and according to the family members I've been able to talk to, had relatively happy lives. That totally changed in the last century. The global economy undercut rural places like that. And because agriculture in California was subsidized a great deal, it was no longer profitable to grow anything on small farms, on somewhat more marginal land. And people left to go other places, and exploitative industries came in, like strip mining for coal and dope growing and stuff like that. And so you've had a cycle of downward social trajectory there. And meanwhile, places like Silicon Valley, are seen as the global success model. But if you actually drive through Silicon Valley, there's not much to look at. There are no big new cities being developed. There's just a lot of disconnected suburban sprawl. There's no, beautiful plazas and museums and, markets, places people come together. It's very atomized. And there's a lot of poor people. There's a lot of people who can't afford housing. There's a lot of people who are commuting 2 and 3 hours a day to get there because they can't afford to live there. There's a lot of people of color who are being displaced. Communities like East Palo Alto, which is right next to Palo Alto, which is one of the powerhouses of Silicon Valley. East Palo Alto was an African American and Japanese immigrant community, and those people are being displaced. So lots of inequity, lots of harm being done. The winners aren't really winners. We need to rethink this whole model whereby capital drains from some places to other places. And in the end, only a few people win and most of us lose.
I think the sort of level of inequity that Stephen is talking about is important to note that, the real concentration of wealth and, people who have everything and kind of don't even realize that a lot of people don't have anything. So, we live in this world where I was really struck this week where there was this tweet from the Wharton professor, and then they asked, the Wharton students how much money like an average person makes. And they said, it's 6 figures. And, so there's a real disconnect between the winners don't even understand. They have no concept of what's happening in a lot of these places. And that makes us divided, and it hurts us all.
And if I can pitch into that again on a more positive note, I think the vision in the future is communities everywhere that are quite a bit more self-sufficient and produce more stuff both locally and within the broader region, but aren't importing it from the other side of the world, and keep the capital circulating locally so that residents aren't forced to move thousands of miles to find a job that pays them what they need. Yes, we will still be connected globally. Yes, some things will still travel, and some people long distances, but much of our lives will be more focused on particular pieces of land that we will take care of better. And in particular communities, diverse communities, that we will steward better and we will understand better. And we will not insulate ourselves from people that are different from us, but we will be a part of a community with them. This sort of more localized vision has been around for, quite a while. It has been tried different places, and it's often been undercut by, the forces of globalization. We need to be sophisticated about how we pursue it in the future and stop undercutting it and start supporting it.
You all have been talking about the book for a little while, I imagine, after it was released. I'm curious if there is something about the book that you wish you were asked more about that maybe you don't get to talk about as much.
That's a really good question. For me, I just love talking about any part of it. And the only thing I mind is when people just don't ask anything. We all have to be curious about our future, and our society's future, our community's future. And a lot of people have trouble finding the energy for that, which I understand in some ways, but I think we all need to find that energy and engage.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm happy. It came out pretty recently, sort of it came out in December 2021. So it's interesting to see people sort of use it. I'm using it in a class of mine, and I was really excited to hear one of my students was saying, this book made me so happy. I was like, wow, okay, that's cool. That's not what I expected, but that's awesome. Yeah. So, I mean, I think to me, books take a long time to write. And by the time they come out, you're always on to the next thing. So I think that's the challenge. But I feel like this book sort of has some staying power because it deals with there's just so much in it that, I think it can stick around for a few years holding the space okay. But, things are changing all the time, and our understanding of sustainability a few years from now, you'll want to read a different book, So I think it's just building this knowledge, which is kind of exciting to play some small piece of that.
Or maybe it'll turn into a pattern language, like you mentioned a number of times in the book, Christopher Alexander's longtime book that folks still reference even today. I think for me, when I was reading it, and I cover this stuff fairly frequently, I have a newsletter, we go through 1,500 items a day. and I cover a lot of different topics in sustainability. And there's so many topics in here that I don't think I'd read about or I hadn't heard the idea of. And I liked bringing government into it. I liked thinking about different ways of structuring, governments. I also like the idea of thinking about a land maximum, those types of things that are just ideas that, might get floated around from time to time, but aren't really articulated as much as just thrown out as kind of an argument at a pool party or something along those lines. So what I appreciated was just the breadth of the ideas and the thinking outside the box. It wasn't just the usual suspects, as it were. I mean, obviously, when I'm on Twitter, I can read folks talking about Henry George, but there's, a lot of folks that might not have heard his name, or specifically that discussion about land capping was really fascinating. So I appreciate that as well. Were there any topics that you all, when you're researching, that you found were new to you?
Well, that particular one, I did find was new to me, the idea that a society could set a maximum amount of land that an individual could own. And multiple nations have done that. Finland, I think, probably did it the most, where I think their limit was something around 200 acres, and anything over that went back to the common pool. And it seems like a good amount to me. I mean, how much land can one person really use, even if you're farming it with equipment? We have people who own as much land as entire states, stuff like that. We need for the future, if we're going to think about how do we provide housing for everyone. We have housing crises worldwide right now. It's not just the US, Canadian cities and Asian cities. And so thinking outside the box is so essential to this particular time in history.
At the end, you all discussed the frustration of activism too, which is something I think a lot of people are feeling these days, especially during the pandemic. But you give these 4 archetypes of activists: visionaries, reformers, organizers, and implementers. I'm curious which ones you all are.
Well, for myself, I've been all of those at different times. We all wear multiple hats, and part of the thing I work with students around is trying to be strategic in any given situation. What role do we play? How could we get progressive change to happen? Who has the power here? Is this a time when we need a different vision out here? Is it a time when the vision exists and the goals exist, but nobody's really implementing them? Or we need pressure on a particular part, or we need to change the code in some way? We need to change the nuts and bolts of how this community is run. Different things are going to come up at different times. Right now, personally, I'm involved in leading an effort at UC Davis to end our fossil fuel use. And so some of that is developing the vision of no fossil fuels in this very large campus. Another part was political organizing. Okay, who's got the power here? Well, it's the chancellor and a few other people. How do we put pressure on them? And developing a coalition to do that. And then meeting with them. And now we've gotten them to agree to develop a plan in the next year to eliminate fossil fuels. Now we have to bulldog that and get into the details of the plan and work with the staff to implement. So there's different phases of work that occur at different times and different hats and different people that can come in to do those things. But some of us do have preferred roles, and my preferred role is probably on the vision end.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Steve that there's a time and place for everything. And one of the things that I like about being an academic is that you can really dig in pretty deep into different topics. And, I'm always interested in the nitty gritty of how it works and why didn't it work and that kind of stuff. But, right now I'm working on a project to put in purple air monitors in Philly and working with the universities trying to get them to really sort of counter the city's air monitoring plans that, they have 10 monitors that really aren't capturing the environmental justice concerns of the city. So really trying to think about, how do we use all these resources that are already out there and capitalize on them and connect with middle schools and STEM education and, public health issues. So yeah, I mean, I think you have to have the vision of what that is and why you need it. And then you got to get in there and, people are emailing me, how do I get one of these monitors? Who's paying? And, so there are a lot of details that you have to figure out. But I mean, I think the thing is to figure out what you're good at, and where your strengths are, and then roll with it. I mean, one thing that the past, few years, particularly since I've gotten tenure, I'm not afraid to write news articles about how the city should be doing something that they're not doing. And I think that's the real, ability of being an academic, is to be able to ask those questions and push people in different ways because of my job. So I'm going to, keep doing that work and be as loud as I can.
My last question is about public meetings. There's a section on creating a more functional democracy, and you focus a bit on public meetings. And I'm wondering, even after reading your suggestions, such as meeting moderation and participatory forums, if it's salvageable at all. And maybe what's the first best step if it is salvageable, which I think that you would say it is, but sometimes I wonder.
That's a question that comes up frequently. And there's no easy answer. We have a lot of anger and frustration locally among citizens, among residents, and there's a big backlog of that. There are a lot of little steps that can help processes move forward, keeping things positive, being constructive, listening well to people, rephrasing people's arguments so that they know they've been heard, making sure that one group doesn't dominate the meeting, keeping things short and constructive and focus on goals. There are skills of facilitation that are very important for us all to, or particularly those of us involved in public meetings, to practice. But there's no quick shortcut. We need to build trust. We need to build back social capital, which has been eroded in this country a lot and in many countries. We need leaders who build trust, who help us learn, who set out visions that we can understand and that will allow us to get over the real work that we're going to have to do to get there. I don't know if I'm answering your question very well, but it is one of the most fundamental. How do we get out of this very fractious place that we're in as a society?
A lot of the work that I'm doing now is with community groups in North Philadelphia. And that, somebody said to me, and I don't know who to attribute this to, so it's not me, but said, collaboration moves at the speed of trust. And so, people say, what have you been doing? You met with all these people, like through Zoom, we've been having these community meetings and talking, just really listening to people about what they want. And what occurs to me is that, our public participation process is often about asking people what they don't want. And people have to fight so hard just to be heard. And I think part of it is that allowing people who have traditionally been denied that power to shape what's important to them and to define that, and then giving them voice. So we have some really interesting, in Philly, we have this Citizen Planning Institute where, citizens learn how to be planners and really kind of making the sort of tools of reimagining the future and visioning accessible to people who are typically on the receiving end of a lot of negative stuff. So how do we get those people who really have been trained in the trenches of participation, but they've had a bad experience? How do we take their interest in shaping their communities and flip that so we start to listen to them? I actually think there's so many new roles for technology and, reimagining. Like my kids are on Roblox all the time, building and Minecraft. And, so like this new generation, they're already, so technologically savvy and understand sort of the possibility. And I think part of it is we kind of have to stop just showing up with a bunch of baked projects and asking people to, what do you think about it? We need to show up way earlier and have a real discussion about what are your current conditions? How do we improve them? What are the challenges of climate? All these other things. So I definitely think there's a lot of work that we can already do, but in the future, we're going to also have to just totally rethink public participation. That's a growth area, I would say, looking for good, smart people to help fill that out.
Let me try to take a historical perspective also to this question very quickly. In the middle of the 20th century, we had planners, designers, policymakers who often didn't consider the public at all and who just made decisions. And we had programs like urban renewal, which bulldozed entire neighborhoods with huge racial and social equity destruction. And then we had 50 years of gradual inclusion, which for the most part has been really important. And we have had lots of public process that has developed to get that inclusion happening. Every city holds lots of workshops and public meetings and design charrettes and you name it around any plan or any big policy change. Well, that was good to a certain extent, but it often didn't address the underlying power dynamics, who really had power in that place and was going to make decisions in the end. So people were still frustrated. And if you have all these endless series of public meetings, you burn people out. You burn both the ordinary citizens and you burn the staff out. And in the end, you wind up with just those people that are the angriest or have the biggest stake in the given issue. And it's not really democratic at all. Plus, there are some constituencies that you will never get in a public meeting. Future generations, by definition, are not going to be represented. And the natural world is not going to be represented unless somebody takes that on themselves. Many undocumented individuals or many groups in society are not going to be represented, even if you try your best to get them to turn out. So we're at the point of needing a new paradigm of public engagement where we do have some process, but it's thorough but limited. And we have good inclusion and everybody adopts the mindsets of including these other groups that are never going to be there. And we do address the underlying power imbalances and we build the trust. So how exactly that's going to happen, I couldn't tell you, but I think we've got to go in that direction.
Well, they can start by reading your book, Reimagining Sustainable Cities, Strategies for Designing Greener, Healthier, and More Equitable Communities. Where can folks find it if they want to get a copy?
Well, any independent bookstore can order it for you, and independent online booksellers. I like powells.com myself, but there are others. I would suggest not using Amazon. Amazon has had lots of detrimental effects on local communities, running local bookstores out of business, for example. But I am sure that you can find an independent bookseller online who can get it for you.
Yeah, we usually tell folks to go to bookshop.org if you can't get to your local bookseller and click on the local bookseller that's closest to you that's affiliated with them so that you can pick up the book. I've done that a number of times. And even, mine is Folio Books here in San Francisco, and I order through them pretty frequently. So thank you all for coming on the show. We really, really appreciate your time. And thanks for a great book. I will say for folks, this is a really thick book of information and awesome knowledge. There's land management to personal responsibility, functional democracies to natural systems. You cover the gamut of things. We just kind of scratched the surface a little bit, like a lottery ticket almost, the little parts that come off, because there's so much depth to this. And I really appreciate your work on it. And thanks again for coming on the show.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much, Jeff, for having us.
And thanks for joining us. The Talking Kidways podcast is a project of The Overhead Wire and posted first at Streetsblog USA. Thanks to our wonderful Patreon supporters for sponsoring this show and Mondays at The Overhead Wire. You can support the show by going to patreon.com/TheOverheadWire. You can sign up for our 15-year-old newsletter at TheOverheadWire.com. And you can listen to the show on your podcatcher of choice, including Spotify, Stitcher, SoundCloud, iHeartRadio, and Apple Podcasts. And if you can't find it there, you can always find it its original home at usa.streetsblog.org. We'll see you next time at Talking Headways.